Hi everyone, welcome to Uke Theory with Stead. In this video and the next one, I'm going to explain what modes are and how to use them. And modes can come across as a really inaccessible and really kind of mystical, unusual form of creating and understanding music. But actually, once you really drill down into the theory, they're not that complex to understand, and they can be really useful to make your playing sound a bit more exotic and a bit more interesting, and also to help understand music theory and music history. The simple way of thinking about modes is they're quite simply scales or pitch collection. So that just think you're an artist and you have a palette that you're going to make a painting with, and it's just 7 different colours or several different notes or pitches that you can create a composition from. It's really that simple. And each mode has a different interval. That just means the distance between the different notes that make them up. So back in medieval times, and even before that, actually, some of these go back to ancient Greece, hence the name. People didn't just use 2 scales to form music. Somehow over the years, in modern, particularly in modern popular music, we tend to create all of our chords and scales in terms of what we solo with and create melodies with, just out of 2 scales, either the major scale or the minor scale, or some very minor variation of those 2. But in the olden days, people used to use 7 different scales to create music from, and these were called the modes. Now, there's lots of different ways to think about modes, and hopefully the way that I explain it will make it sound less mystical and vague and more kind of tangible and easy to understand. But basically, the way modes were created was to take one scale, the major scale. You know, the do, re, mi one that we all understand, like the C major scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. One of the first scales that we learn. And if you don't know that one, you can always look back to my earlier video on major scales where I will explain how to play that and how to form it. Now, that major scale is just a series of intervals. And what are intervals? Just the distance between 2 notes. And those intervals will either be a whole step or 2 frets on your ukulele, or a half step or 1 fret on your ukulele. Okay, so a whole step or a half step. And a major scale, the do, re, mi one that we all know, is a whole step, a whole step, a half step, a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, and a half step. And that makes up our major scale. Now, what if we played the same scale, but we started on the 2nd note? Now, I could just play a C major scale starting on a D, and I would have what we call the Dorian mode. It has a slightly different feeling, doesn't it, from that C major mode? The reason it's different is that the intervals between the notes are different. Look at the first 2 notes. In Ionian, we have a whole and a whole. In a Dorian, we have a whole and a half, which creates a more minor key feel for things. So the difference of those intervals is what makes each of these modes sound different. And quite simply, wherever you start in this scale gives you a new mode. So you've heard the Ionian and Dorian. The Phrygian mode, if I started on an E in the C major scale, would give a different feeling again, and so on and so forth through the Lydian, the Mixolydian, the Aeolian, and the Locrian. Now, I don't like to think of things in that way. I had to show you because that's how we build the modes. That's kind of how they came into existence in a way. But really, the way I like to think about these modes are different collections of notes with different intervals. don't think about them all coming back to one scale. So don't think about the Dorian being the C major scale starting with D. Just think about the Dorian being related to another scale, and you'll see the differences between them in a minute. I'll show you what I mean. There's a real way of simplifying these scales and learning them and understanding them. Now, do you remember back to an earlier video, when we build the chords of every key, we end up with 3 major chords, 3 minor chords, and a diminished chord, okay? So for instance, some of the chords that make up the key of C, you would have C major, but then you would have D minor, E minor, F major, and so on and so forth. Now, the same thing happens with the modes. We have 3 major modes, 3 minor modes, and then we have a weird kind of Locrian mode, which is like almost like a diminished one. I'll show you that in a minute. I know it's dropped off the bottom, I think, of the picture. I'll show you. I'll tip down in a moment. Now, the easiest way to learn the modes and to understand their context is to think of them in relation to 2 other modes. So these look really kind of mystical and hard to understand. There's 7 modes. How am I going to remember all those different pitch collections? Well, it's really easy. Think about the Ionian mode. And again, that's just named after a place in Greece. Nothing more fancy than that. Think about the Ionian mode as your normal major scale, because that's exactly what it is. Okay, you probably already know that one, and I've showed it you today. Think about your Aeolian mode as your natural minor scale. Okay, so if you're not sure of that, in the key of C, that would be. Okay, that's your natural minor scale. Your natural minor scale has a flatted third, a flatted 6, and a flatted 7. And to make it easier to see this, all of the minor scales I have drawn in orange, and the major scales in black, and then this weird diminished Locrian one on its own in green. So let's have a look at some of the major ones. So we already know the major scale. Well, the Dorian scale, if we have these intervals here, a whole, half, whole, 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 half, but we start it from C like we do the Ionian, so you can hear the difference between those scales. Notice that the only difference between the Lydian and the Ionian is this sharped 4. Okay, that's literally the only difference. So if I play this Lydian scale, and you can play along if you want, we've got a C, D, E, but now we have an F sharp, G, A, B, C. Let me put that together. C major, C Lydian. So one of the ways that we could use these scales, and I'll go on to this in much more detail in the next video, but is to create little melodies. And by changing the interval here between the third and a sharped 4, it creates a different feeling in a piece and adds a little bit of exoticism to it. So for instance, I could have quite a boring little kind of melody that's something like, so that's C, D, E, F, A, G, F, E. That's just an example. If I do that one again, and I turn the Fs into F sharps, it creates a whole different feeling, which is really lovely. And that's one way that musicians use these scales. And the Lydian creates a kind of unusual, really uplifting and quite upbeat sort of scale. It's used for the Simpsons theme. Whoops. That's the start. that, isn't it? To the Simpsons theme, for example. So using these different scales can create a different mood. The Mixolydian one is quite often used to solo and create melodies in blues music because it has this lovely flatted seventh note. Let's play the Mixolydian. The Mixolydian is created by using the fifth step of the scale. We have a whole, whole, half, whole, whole, half, whole. So basically the only difference between Mixolydian and your normal major scale, the Ionian one, is that we have that flat seven. I've ringed it in red to make so you can see the difference. So let's try that. So this would sound like a normal C major scale, which would be this. Only this time we have a B flat at the end, which gives a different feeling again. Okay. So again, if you're thinking back to remembering all these different scales, you don't need to learn them all off by heart, and you don't need to know these strange names off by heart, each single one of them. Just think about them in relation to either the major scale or the minor scale. So the Lydian is the same as the major scale with a sharped fourth, and the Mixolydian is just like the major scale but with a flatted seven. It's that simple. The Aeolian scale, which starts on the 6th degree of the C major scale, or any major scale, is your natural minor scale. That's the one, if you're playing in a minor key, that is most often used by composers. And you probably know this already, this one. So here we have a first, a second, a flatted third, a fourth, a fifth, a flatted sixth, and a flat seven, and those three flat notes create a kind of a somber or a dark kind of sound. So for instance, C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B, C. So a lot darker sounding than the major scale. And that is another use of these modes if you want to create a mood. So these scales, the major scale is quite upbeat sounding. The Lydian, because it has that sharpened fourth, is probably even more upbeat and uplifting sounding. The Mixolydian is kind of upbeat and uplifting, but the use of that flatted seven gives it a little bit of grittiness, so it's quite often used for kind of bluesy stuff. The minor scale is obviously quite sad sounding, and when you add even more flat notes to the minor scale, it sounds even darker and kind of more morose sounding. So the Phrygian is quite rarely used actually anyway, but it creates a very kind of tense and dark atmosphere. The Dorian is the least dark sounding of the minor scales, and the reason is that it only has 1, 2 flats in it. The 6th note isn't flatted. That's the difference between the Dorian and the Aeolian. Let's try the Dorian so you can hear the difference. If I do the Aeolian first. And the Dorian. So by having that A note rather than the A flat, doesn't sound quite as dark or kind of sad as the Aeolian. Let's have a look at the Phrygian. This one is rarely used. There are 2 scales here which are 2 modes that are used less than any of the others, and that's the Phrygian and that is the Locrian. And that's because our ears find it really uncomfortable with a scale that starts with a half step. We've just got so used to this, both the minor scale, the Aeolian, and the Ionian, so think of them as just the natural minor and the major scale, both of them start with a whole step. And having this kind of half step feels really uncomfortable to us. So they're not that commonly used in music. But let's have a look at it. Let's try the Phrygian. So this time I'd have C, D flat, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, C. Kind of quite exotic sounding, but a little bit dark. That starting is particularly ominous, isn't it? Quite unusual. And again, simplifies things further. If we know that that Phrygian is rarely used, you've only really got 2 minor scales to learn, and all you need to know is if you know your natural minor, Dorian is almost the same, only it has this 6 instead of a flatted 6, and 3 major scales. Not that bad, huh? And if you know your major scale and you learn those 2 differences, easy peasy. Okay, let's have a look at the Locrian. I'm going to try and tip this camera down a little bit. There we go, it's just appeared at the bottom. You've lost my head, but that doesn't matter. Hello there. So the Locrian is a really unusual one. And you know that the last chord that is built in any key is that unusual diminished sounding chord. And a diminished chord is called a diminished chord because to diminish something, you take away, and we're flattening notes. We're kind of reducing them in pitch, if you like. And the Locrian has loads of flats. Look at this: D flat, E flat, G flat, A flat, B flat. It's almost like everything's been diminished and pushed down. Starts with a half step, so it sounds a kind of probably a little bit uncomfortable already. So let's do that. C, D flat, E flat, F, G flat, A flat, B flat, C. So it sounds a little bit unusual and weird, so it's not often used. So hopefully just by simplifying that, you'll see that if you want to start playing around with modes, there's not that much to learn. You just need to already know your major and your minor scale and just spot the 2 differences in them. It's as simple as that. Now, in the next video, I'm going to put that into context. So we're going to look at how to physically use them. Why would a composer use one of these modes rather than just sticking to the major and minor scale? And how can you use them in your own playing? I hope that wasn't too, I hope that shed some light on things and it wasn't too difficult to understand. But as I say, in the next video, when you see the use of them, you'll see that it was worth learning it. I promise. See you.